Midterms matter. On the eve of Election Day, many have no plan to vote, but there's a lot at stake.
And EWTN News Nightly is hitting the campaign trail. I'm Wyatt Goolsby reporting from Kentucky, where the latest on Democrats and Republicans rally for last-minute votes.
Ballot issues. We break down some important referenda voters will find in some states. And Pope Francis holds with tradition in remembering the dead, celebrating All Saints and All Souls. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, November 3rd, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us on this election eve. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Polls open in the morning, and tonight both sides know control of the U.S. Senate rides on two things: getting out the vote and the president's popularity or lack of it. If Republicans take the Senate, Mitch McConnell assumes the role of Senate Majority Leader. But first, he has to win. He faces Kentucky's Democratic Secretary of State at the polls tomorrow. Wyatt Goolsby covering both campaigns today and joining us tonight from Newport in northern Kentucky. Wyatt?
Yes, Brian, it has been a whirlwind day, both for Senator Mitch McConnell, who wants to keep his Senate space, and for Allison Lunder and Grimes, the challenger, who is trying to oust the five-term senator from here. As you mentioned, we're in Newport, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati, where earlier today Grimes made one of her campaign stops. But our first stop came in Louisville, where Senator McConnell looked to give a morale boost to his campaign volunteers. McConnell says he wants to be the next majority leader in the Senate, hoping that his fellow Republicans across the country will take control of the upper chamber. He says his election is a referendum on many of President Obama's policies, which he stands opposed. He called for his supporters and volunteers to press ahead for the next 48 hours.
To influence everybody in your family, everybody you know. Many of you have been going door to door. We're deeply grateful for it. This is a chance to begin to save this country. I'm counting on you. Do it for yourself, not for us. Let's go out there and sock it to them. Thank you very much.
The latest NBC Marist poll puts McConnell ahead of his opponent by 9%. Meanwhile, 35-year-old Allison Lunder and Grimes also bounced around Kentucky today, making numerous stops, including here in Newport. Grimes has embraced the underdog status, saying this is a campaign like David and Goliath, only David is a woman.
Seniority might be worth something if Mitch McConnell weren't up for sale to the highest bidder. And folks, we're ready to send the message that Washington has enough senators bought and paid for by millionaires and billionaires. We're ready for a senator of the people of this state. Will you fight?
One concern for some Catholics has been Grimes' support of pro-choice policies. We caught up with one Grimes supporter who says Kentuckians have to consider the wider picture.
And I am Catholic. I'm a devoted Catholic. And I don't believe in birth control, but I believe in taking care of the people and children that were born in our country.
Grimes supporters say McConnell has been in office for too long and it's time to bring in a fresh face. Right now, though, it looks like it will be an uphill battle for Grimes to have a chance. And of course, Brian, we are going to continue to follow both camps tomorrow for Election Day itself, and we'll continue to bring you live updates tomorrow at 6 and 9 o'clock. Brian?
Well, Kentucky's my home state, and I know the pundits say that McConnell is he struggles with popularity there. Why is he so far ahead in the polls?
Well, yes, there are some polls that show that McConnell is not quite as popular, but even for some voters, if he's not quote-unquote the ideal candidate, many of them who are conservative still see McConnell as a relatively better option than Allison Grimes. Throughout this entire election, Grimes has had to distance herself from President Obama and from other Democrats in Congress. Brian?
All right, Wyatt Goolsby will be there, of course, tomorrow night with our Midterms Matter coverage. We'll have more on ballot issues around the country a little later on tonight. Stay tuned for Jason Calvi's report. Midterms matter as we continue our EWTN News Nightly coverage of election 2014. We'll be back with more on the issues in a moment, but Pope Francis celebrates Mass today for all the cardinals and bishops who died during the past year. At the main altar in St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope was joined by priests and bishops and cardinals. It's an annual papal tradition. Of course, the Church encourages all Catholics to pray for the dead during the month of November. Last night, Pope Francis went down to the crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica to pray at the tombs of his predecessors. He blessed their graves and prayed for the popes who have gone before him, including our first pope, St. Peter himself. The Holy Father celebrated All Saints' Day Mass for a large crowd at Verano, Rome's sprawling cemetery. The relics of St. John the 23rd and John Paul II, canonized in April, were displayed for veneration. Pope Francis paid tribute to what he called the unknown saints, the poor, the jobless, and the homeless. He also lamented what he calls the throwaway culture of today.
Si scartano I bambini, si scartano gli anziani, si scartano I giovani.
The Pope saying children, the elderly, and young people who are unemployed are discarded or ignored in many countries. The Supreme Court is leaving in place part of a New York City law aimed at regulating pro-life pregnancy centers. The court rejected a free speech appeal today from the centers. Courts have blocked parts of the law, including requirements that the centers disclose whether they provide referrals for abortion, emergency contraception, or prenatal care. A lawyer with the Alliance Defending Freedom, which defends these centers, says his group will continue to fight to protect their free speech rights. Investigators are beginning to piece together a dramatic spacecraft explosion and crash that killed a pilot and hospitalized a second pilot. The Virgin Galactic Spaceship 2 disintegrated during a test flight on Friday over California's Mojave Desert. The cause of the crash is still a mystery, but evidence points to an early deployment of a system that rotates the tail, creating drag. Virgin Group founder Sir Richard Branson still plans to be on the first flight that takes tourists into space.
If I didn't feel it was safe enough for myself, I would not ask other people to take a flight.
It could take as long as a year to determine the cause of Friday's accident. Branson can't say how long this may delay the first tourist flight. He had hoped to start flying passengers as soon as next year. Brittany Maynard, the young woman in Portland, Oregon with brain cancer, stood by her decision, sadly ending her own life on Saturday. Maynard and her husband moved to Oregon. That's the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide earlier this year. She had just received a cancer diagnosis and was told she only had months to live. Maynard, who was weeks away from her 30th birthday, said her husband supported her decision to end her life. Hundreds have used the law to induce their own deaths, the average age being 71. Assisted deaths are legal in 4 other states: New Mexico, Vermont, Montana, and Washington. We are joined now by Lila Rose, president of Live Action, a nonprofit dedicated to building a culture of life. So sad, this decision. What impact do you think it will have on end-of-life issues and the debate that's going on?
It's heartbreaking, and a part of the reason it's because it's sending a message to those with terminal illness that instead of focusing on palliative care and improving hospice care and improving pain management for those who are suffering, that the doctor can now be recommending end-of-life drugs to say, okay, let's just take your life. It's not worth it anymore to fight. There's not hope for you. It's terrible messages to send to hundreds, thousands of people who are struggling with terminal illness or difficult diagnoses where they are wondering, is there an opportunity for me to fight this? And instead the message is, no, it's better to die. And the way to die with dignity is through suicide, which is completely the wrong message to send to those who are suffering.
This has received a lot of attention, of course. I wonder, as this legislation is out there pending, this assisted suicide legislation, do you think this story, this very tragic story, will speed up passage of that or slow it down?
Well, I think it all depends on the messages that we get out there to fight back against this kind of positive or compassion frame that has been put around the death of Brittany, which is a tragedy and an injustice against her own life and the value of her own life. So you have legislation being considered in states, has been considered in states like Massachusetts, where Senator Ted Kennedy's own wife was saying when he was diagnosed and was killed ultimately by his brain tumor, saying we shouldn't have physician-assisted suicide in the state of Massachusetts because you're telling people that their life doesn't have dignity if they're suffering. And a lot of these diagnoses are wrong because you get this idea that you're going to die in 6 months, but then some people can live far beyond that. And those are the stories we need to be getting out there of the deaths that had such dignity, naturally managing pain and spending those last moments with family.
You're very close with the pro-life movement, and it's so often associated with abortion, which it is, but these end-of-life issues are very important to pro-life people.
So important. I mean, life is precious from the moment of conception until natural death. And this is a frontier that we need to be very active on talking about the importance of investing in hospice, palliative care, end-of-life pain management, talking about the dignity of suffering and the dignity of life, and how Brittany's life had dignity, and she, it was so tragic to see the video she released days before her death saying she had just spent time with, her family in the Grand Canyon, and she was enjoying her moments of life despite the pain she was enduring, but there was pressure on her from many euthanasia, suicide advocates saying the way to do this is to take it into your own hands and to kill yourself, and that's exactly the messages we need to be fighting.
She was so young, Lila, like
young.
you. What
Yes.
is your generation? Where do they stand on this issue?
I mean, I think we're figuring it out, and I think that's why it's all the more important to be talking about the importance of life having meaning even despite suffering. I think of my friend Philip Johnson, who's also a millennial like myself, who is just about to be ordained into the diaconate. Several years back, he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, and they said he had maybe 18 months to live. Well, he outlived that by years.
And now he's becoming a deacon.
And now he's becoming a deacon, and he begged in a public letter in Time, he begged Brittany Maynard to reconsider her decision. So his voice is out there talking about the value of his life, so we need to get those voices out there, and we're making up our minds, and now's a crucial time to be telling the story of the dignity of life and the dignity and the meaningfulness even of suffering.
You put it very well. Lila Rose, president of Live Action, thanks for being with us tonight. Coming up, there are crucial issues on the ballot in many states. What you need to know to cast an informed vote. A good example brings about so much good, but hypocrisy brings about much evil. From the official Twitter feed of Pope Francis, from November 1st, the Feast of All Saints. You're watching EWTN News Nightly for Monday, the 3rd of November. I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for joining us. As we go to the polls tomorrow in the midterm elections, President Obama's name isn't on the ballot, but certainly his policies are. He is having an impact on the races. We go to Chief White House correspondent Susanne LaFrankie for more tonight.
The president's public schedule has him working from the White House both today and tomorrow, which is unusual for a sitting president right before a midterm election. However, over the weekend, the president stumped hard for Democratic candidates.
You've had the fastest job growth in decades.
Last night, the president was in Connecticut, part of a 3-stop campaign in Democratic safe havens, trying to excite his base. Although he's not on the ballot, the president has repeatedly said his policies are. GOP officials are seizing on his low approval ratings, which have overshadowed state contests. Roughly 60% of eligible voters are expected to stay home this election. Still, Democratic Party leaders are predicting victory despite disappointing polls.
First of all, I don't agree with the odds makers. I predict we're gonna keep the Senate.
Leading polls say there are 9 toss-up states. 6 of them are currently held by Democrats. At the White House today, spokesman Josh Earnest said Democratic candidates can rely on Obama's get-out-the-vote strategy.
They're also backed by a tried-and-true ground campaign strategy that, in the context of a very, very close race, can provide a 2 to 3 point margin that could eventually make up the difference.
In 2008, he could do no wrong. He was a rock star.
But even if Republicans do win control of both houses, Washington Examiner political commentator Beckett Adams says they'll have to reach across the aisle and push for issues that appeal to both sides.
That's not really a long-term lasting goal. It's one thing to say vote for us because we're not him, but in 2 years there is no more him. That's what Republicans need to deal with.
Senator Rand Paul, who is a likely presidential candidate in 2016 for the Republicans, was recently quoted as saying that the Republican brand is so broken and that they must change their policies in order to attract Latino voters, African Americans, and the youth vote. Reporting from the White House, I'm Susanne LaFrankie for EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Suzanne. Abortion, marijuana, and the minimum wage, all issues on some state ballots tomorrow. As we continue our Midterms Matter team coverage tonight, Jason Calvi takes a closer look at these issues.
Pro-life issues hit some ballots tomorrow. Colorado voters will decide if their constitution should be amended to define the unborn as persons. A North Dakota amendment would say humans at any stage of development have the inalienable right to life. And in Tennessee, a proposed amendment would give the legislature more power to regulate abortion. In Illinois, voters will decide on a suggestion to their state legislature whether birth control should be covered in health insurance plans.
This was put on the ballot by basically the governor and members of the Democratic Party in order to gin up their base so they can come out and vote tomorrow on Election Day. The initiatives are only advisory, so they have no legal binding force of law.
Marijuana is another issue heating up state ballots tomorrow. Here in D.C., the debate is whether marijuana can be legally grown and possessed. Voters in Oregon and Alaska will decide if pot can be sold and used by those over 21. And in Florida, the question is whether to allow marijuana use for medical reasons.
Was once polling near 90%, and now the initiative isn't necessarily going to have an easy time tomorrow.
In several states, will let voters say if the minimum wage should be raised. And other state voters will be weighing in on many other issues, including guns, gambling, and GMOs, whether packaged food that is genetically modified should require special labeling. The National Conference of State Legislatures says there's a total of 147 ballot measures to be voted on tomorrow. Brian?
All right, thank you, Jason. And you can count on EWTN News Nightly for election night coverage. We'll be here with our regular newscast starting at 6 Eastern, and then live coverage beginning at 9 as the returns come in. Midterms Matter here on EWTN. Well, Cardinal Timothy Dolan announces plans to merge almost a third of the churches in the Archdiocese of New York. The plan to merge 112 of the 368 parishes is the result of a year-long review. It's effective August 1st, 2015. Plans have not been announced for the church buildings that will no longer be used in the Archdiocese. Well, more than 13 years after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the new World Trade Center is now open for business. Condé Nast Publishing staff began working in the Freedom Tower this morning as the first commercial client in America's tallest building. The 104-story skyscraper is the centerpiece of the 16-acre site where the Twin Towers once stood until September 11, 2001. More than 2,700 people died in the terror attacks. A New York official said the new $3.9 billion state-of-the-art building is the most secure office building in America. Up next, an acclaimed daredevil turns to prayer to accomplish incredible tightrope walks between Chicago skyscrapers. Thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly on Monday, November 3rd. I'm Brian Patrick. Some political hopefuls are using social media to connect with voters on the 21st Century Campaign Trail. Catherine Elliott looks at the social media platforms politicians are using and how effective they may be.
Political candidates are going where the voters are on their smartphones. In 2014, social media is a requirement and appealing for two reasons. Digital can be a fraction of the cost of traditional television campaign ads, and it's a way to try to reach a key demographic, voters ages 18 to 29 who often buoy a presidential race but tend to stay on the sidelines during midterms. Facebook and Twitter will still be the giants in the Election Day social arena, mostly because they've been there the most. Facebook has an interactive map of governors, Senate, and House candidates, their pages, user likes, and how much discussion they're generating on the platform. Twitter also is tracking political tweets and top election issues, and puts candidate accounts in one place on their election dashboard. But some candidates have embraced tools that didn't even exist during the 2010 midterms or the 2012 campaign. Twitter introduced the video app, Vine, for example, in January 2013. The social media outreach is an innovative step toward 2016, but it may not have too much of an effect on this election day. Pre-midterm research from the Harvard Institute of Politics found a disconnect between young voters' political activity on social networking platforms and political action offline. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
All right, thanks a lot, Catherine. And tonight we revisit the hidden camera video of a young woman being harassed on New York City streets. The video documents dozens of unsolicited comments from strange men as an actress spends 10 hours walking the streets of New York City. A nonprofit dedicated to combating harassment funded the video, which has now been viewed more than 30 million times on YouTube. The video has sparked debate over what constitutes harassment and whether it's really a problem.
I don't feel that when I walk to the grocery store, if I drop my kids off at school, or if I walk through an office building, this is not really happening. It's happening in certain kinds of neighborhoods. It's happening where places are highly populated, like in the middle of Times Square, like the video showed. I think we want to keep it in perspective.
All right, Patrick Truman will be joining us now from Morality and Media and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Patrick, I wonder how you respond to that reaction from the Independent Women's Forum. It doesn't happen to her, she said, but does happen in some places.
Well, it happens to almost every woman, depending on where you are. It's not happening in church,
but it is happening in the cities, and it's happening in good-sized cities and small cities. Women get sexually harassed because we live in a sexualized culture that the sexual revolution has wrought. And it is not a good thing, but it is a reality.
Why would it be considered harassment to tell a woman she's beautiful or say, "How you doing today?"
Well, that's a problem. See, it shouldn't be sexual harassment. But that is not the norm, where a man might say something kind and complimentary. These guys are looking for something back. They're looking for something sexual. So it's, "Hey, baby, got a minute? Hey, baby, what's your number? Hey, if I call you, will you talk to me? Come over here." And there's one person on that video that's actually following her side by side for 5 minutes.
That's scary.
That's sexual harassment.
And even those what seem to be nice comments, depending on the tone of voice, and if they're not welcomed, if they're not invited, that can be seen as a very negative thing. Where do these attitudes come from in men?
Well, I think there's 3 factors, basically. Mass market advertising today has women in sexualized poses, sexualized scenes, selling products. And it's day in, day out, we see it. It's part of our life. The second thing I think is the problem is the pornography that we see. At a young age, kids are getting an overwhelming amount of pornography. And it's not just a few, it's a great number of kids, the high majority of kids, and it goes on to adulthood. And women are portrayed in all pornography as wanting to do anything the man wants. Men are gaining a sense of sexual entitlement for women because of what they're devouring. And of course, the third factor is Hollywood. You see women in sexual poses and nudity on HBO and the movies,
just suggestive
That's right.
remarks. So this has a very adverse effect on our society, doesn't it?
Well, we're training men to be, in effect, sexual predators. Now, not every comment, as you say, is sexual harassment, but the bad has pushed out the good. I'd be afraid walking down a street to just turn to a woman and say, "Hey, you're looking good today," because that is mixed with 35 other comments that she might have just gotten that are sexual harassment. So it's pushing out the good as well.
All right, Patrick Truman from Morality and Media and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. We appreciate your perspective on this issue, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, a true walk of faith last night across Chicago's skyline. Praying out loud several times, the 7th-generation tightrope walking daredevil, Nick Wallenda, made 2 death-defying tightrope walks. He did it without a tether. He was once again he cheated death, and he nabbed a couple of world records in the process. And people were praying with him and for him. And it was certainly an exciting time, and thank God that he is safe. But what an incredible feat. He realized that the incline of this tightrope, even though it was supposed to be 15 degrees, was 19 degrees with a wind blowing at around 30 miles an hour in the Windy City. Well, until tomorrow, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again anytime on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick, and we leave you tonight with images from the Papal Mass in St. Peter's Basilica for the cardinals and bishop who died this past year. Good night and God bless you.